November 23, 1945. The rice paddies outside Yokohama lay dormant under a pale sky, stripped bare by the harvest that had failed to feed the nation. Morning mist clung to the earth like the breath of ghosts. In a farmhouse with paper walls yellowed by smoke and time, an elderly farmer named Tanaka Yoshio knelt before a wooden box buried beneath the floorboards. His hands, gnarled from 50 years of working the soil, trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside lay what remained of his family's rice supply. 3 small sacks, perhaps enough to last until the new year, if his wife measured carefully, if his grandchildren's bellies remained hollow and silent. He pressed his palms together and bowed his head, whispering a prayer to ancestors who had once owned 3 times this land before the war machine consumed everything. Outside, the rumble of engines shattered the morning stillness. Tanaka's daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, her face bloodless. "American soldiers," she whispered, "coming up the road." The old man rose slowly, feeling the weight of 70 years settle into his bones. He had survived the Meiji Restoration, the earthquake of 1923, the grinding machinery of war that had taken his sons. But this, he thought, might be the end. He had heard the stories, the warnings that had echoed through Japanese society for 4 years of total war. The Americans were demons in human form. They would rape the women, murder the men, steal everything, and burn what remained. The radio broadcasts had been explicit. Government officials had distributed cyanide capsules to families near the coast. Better death than dishonor. Better the void than what was coming. Through the gap in the door, Tanaka could see them now. Young men in strange uniforms, their faces pink and unlined, climbing down from massive trucks that dwarfed any vehicle he had ever seen. They carried weapons, yes, but they were slung casually over shoulders. They were laughing. One of them was chewing something, his jaw working rhythmically in a way that seemed almost bovine. Another lit a cigarette with a small metal device that sparked flame from his thumb. Such casual abundance, such strange ease in their movements, as though they had never known a hungry day in their lives. This moment, unremarkable in the vast sweep of occupation that would reshape Japan over the next 7 years, contained within it a collision of worlds so complete that neither side could have anticipated what would happen next. For the Japanese, raised under an ideology that had taught them Americans were subhuman beasts bent on destruction, the encounter would shatter every assumption that had been welded into their minds by years of propaganda. For the Americans, young men who had fought their way across the Pacific killing Japanese soldiers on hellish islands, the interaction would reveal something fundamental about the difference between armies of conquest and armies of liberation. But neither group understood yet what was about to unfold in that farmyard outside Yokohama. Neither could have predicted that this simple exchange, money for food, would become one of the quiet revolutions that transformed not just Japan's future, but the very meaning of what it meant to be conquered. The old farmer's hands were shaking as he stepped outside to meet his fate. To understand the shock that would reverberate through Japanese society in the months following surrender, we must first comprehend the depth of fear that had been methodically cultivated in the Japanese mind. The propaganda apparatus of the Imperial Japanese government had spent 4 years preparing its citizens for the moment when American forces would arrive on Japanese soil. And the message had been unambiguous. The Americans would commit atrocities beyond imagination. From 1941 onward, Japanese civilians had been subjected to a relentless campaign of psychological warfare directed not at the enemy, but at their own people. Radio broadcasts described Americans as demons who wore human skin, creatures driven by bloodlust and racial hatred. Newsreels showed carefully edited footage of American bombing campaigns, omitting entirely the context of Japanese military aggression that had provoked them. Posters depicted American soldiers with exaggerated fangs, their hands dripping with blood, standing over the bodies of Japanese children. In schools, teachers instructed students that Americans tortured prisoners for entertainment, that American soldiers had been trained to show no mercy to civilians, that Japanese women would face fates worse than death if they fell into enemy hands. This was not idle propaganda. The Japanese government genuinely believed, based on their own military's behavior in occupied territories, that conquering armies treated civilians with systematic brutality. The Imperial Japanese Army's conduct in China, Korea, the Philippines, and throughout Southeast Asia had established a template of occupation that involved mass executions, widespread sexual violence, and the complete subjugation of local populations. Japanese military doctrine had explicitly sanctioned the policy of living off the land, a euphemism for seizing food, supplies, and resources from conquered peoples without compensation or mercy. In Nanjing in 1937, Japanese forces had murdered an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians in an orgy of violence that shocked the world. During the occupation of the Philippines, Japanese soldiers had systematically looted farms and villages, leaving communities to starve. Throughout China, the Three Alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, had been official military strategy. When Japanese soldiers requisitioned food from Chinese or Korean farmers, there was no payment, no receipt, no acknowledgement of property rights. There was simply taking. Farmers who resisted were shot. Families who hid their rice were burned out of their homes. The systematic extraction of resources from occupied territories was viewed not as theft, but as the natural order of conquest. The strong devoured the weak. This was the only law that mattered in war. Japanese propaganda therefore assumed that American forces would behave identically. Why wouldn't they? The logic seemed inescapable. Japan had lost the war. America had won. History showed that conquerors took what they wanted. The Japanese government, projecting its own military's behavior onto the enemy, prepared its civilian population for wholesale slaughter, mass rape, and systematic looting on a scale that would make previous atrocities pale by comparison. Government officials distributed poison to families, encouraging them to commit suicide rather than face the Americans. In Okinawa, Japanese soldiers had forced civilians to jump from cliffs rather than surrender to U.S. Marines. Mothers threw their children into the sea and then leapt after them. The depth of fear was absolute. So when American forces landed in Japan in August 1945 and began spreading throughout the countryside in the months that followed, Japanese civilians expected annihilation. They expected their daughters to be raped, their sons to be executed, their homes to be burned, and their food to be stolen. They expected to die. The reality that unfolded would prove so disorienting that many Japanese civilians simply could not process what they were experiencing. The economic situation in Japan in late 1945 was catastrophic. This fact cannot be overstated. The nation was not merely recovering from war, it was actively starving. The careful rationing system that had sustained the population during the war years had collapsed entirely. Average daily caloric intake in major cities had fallen to approximately 1,042 calories per person, roughly 65% of the minimum necessary for basic survival. In Tokyo, citizens were lucky to receive 775 calories per day for 6 continuous months in 1946. Children were dying of malnutrition in the streets. Factory workers collapsed at their stations from hunger. The black market, controlled largely by Yakuza gangs, had become the primary source of food for millions of Japanese, with a pound of rice costing more than a week's wages for the average worker. The agricultural infrastructure that had sustained Japan for centuries had been devastated by the war effort. Fertilizers had been diverted to munitions production. Young men who had worked the farms had been conscripted into the military and killed on distant battlefields. Farming tools had been melted down for metal. The weather in 1944 and 1945 had been poor, leading to reduced yields. And critically, Japan had lost access to rice from its former colonies of Korea and Taiwan, which had provided substantial portions of the nation's food supply before the war. Rural farmers, who traditionally had some buffer against starvation because they produced their own food, were nonetheless desperate. Many had hidden rice from government requisitions during the war, burying it in secret locations to protect their families. But those supplies were running out. The harvest of 1945 had been mediocre at best, and the distribution system was in chaos. Even farmers faced genuine hunger. Into this environment of near famine came American occupation forces numbering more than 430,000 troops. The logistical challenge was immense. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had received explicit instructions U.S. forces were to be self-sufficient. They would bring their own food, their own supplies, their own everything. Under no circumstances were American troops to burden the Japanese population, which was already on the brink of starvation. But military theory and ground-level reality rarely align perfectly. Soldiers in rural outposts needed fresh vegetables, eggs, sometimes meat. Supply chains, no matter how efficient, could not deliver fresh produce to every remote garrison. And so, inevitably, American troops began interacting with Japanese farmers, seeking to supplement their rations with locally available food. This is where the story becomes extraordinary. Tanaka Yoshio stood in his farmyard, his wife and daughter-in-law huddled behind him in the doorway, as 3 American soldiers approached. The tallest one, a boy who looked barely 20 with hair the color of wheat, raised his hand in what might have been a greeting. He was smiling. Tanaka could not understand why a man about to commit murder would smile, but perhaps this was part of the cruelty. Perhaps they enjoyed the fear. "Sir," the young soldier said in English, words that sounded harsh and guttural to Tanaka's ears. "We're looking to buy some eggs, if you have any." Tanaka understood nothing except the tone, which was not threatening. His daughter-in-law, who had learned a few words of English in school before the war, whispered, "They want eggs." Her voice was uncertain, disbelieving. The American soldier reached into his pocket, and Tanaka's body went rigid, certain a weapon was coming. Instead, the young man pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it, extracted several bills, U.S. military scrip, the B-yen that had been introduced by occupation authorities, and held them out. He pointed toward the henhouse visible beside the farmhouse. Then he held up his fingers, counting. 5 fingers. Then he showed the money again. Tanaka stared at the bills. The American wanted to pay. For eggs, he wanted to pay. The old farmer's mind struggled to process this information. In his 70 years, he had seen soldiers take whatever they wanted. He had seen Japanese military officers requisition rice without payment, calling it patriotic duty. He had heard stories of Chinese farmers being shot for hiding food. He had been taught that armies seized, they did not purchase. That was the natural order. That was what soldiers did. But this American boy was standing in his farmyard, holding out money, waiting politely for a response. Tanaka's daughter-in-law broke the paralysis first. She stepped forward carefully, bowed, and gestured toward the henhouse. The American soldier's face brightened. He said something to his companions, and all 3 of them laughed, not cruel laughter, but the easy humor of young men on a pleasant morning. One of them pulled out a cigarette pack, offered one to Tanaka. The old farmer, hands still trembling, accepted it. The American lit it for him with that miraculous thumb lighter. 5 minutes later, Tanaka's wife had gathered a basket of eggs, 12 in total, more than the 5 the soldier had indicated, and brought them outside. The American examined them, nodded with satisfaction, and carefully counted out not just the amount he had initially offered, but twice that. When Tanaka's daughter-in-law tried to explain they only wanted payment for 5, the tall soldier shook his head and pressed all the money into the old man's palm. Then he touched 2 fingers to his forehead in some kind of salute, said, "Thank you, sir," loaded the eggs carefully into a canvas bag, and walked back toward the truck with his companions. Tanaka stood in his farmyard holding U.S. military scrip, smelling American tobacco, watching the truck disappear down the road. His wife and daughter-in-law emerged fully from the house, their faces stunned. None of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Tanaka's wife whispered, "They paid us." The old farmer nodded slowly. "They paid us." It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary, unremarkable transaction in any normal circumstance. Money exchanged for goods, the basic function of commerce that had existed for thousands of years. But in that moment, in that farmyard, with the memory of propaganda still echoing in their minds and the expectation of violence still tight in their chests, it was a revolution. This scene, with minor variations, played out thousands of times across rural Japan in the months following surrender. American soldiers, following strict orders from their commanders, paid for food they obtained from Japanese civilians. They paid in military scrip, in actual U.S. dollars, sometimes in cigarettes or chocolate or other goods that had value on the black market. They paid fair prices, often overpaying. They said please and thank you through interpreters or with gestures. They treated farmers with basic courtesy, and Japanese civilians were astounded. The policy was intentional and explicit. General MacArthur had made it absolutely clear that American forces would conduct themselves with discipline and respect toward the Japanese civilian population. This was not merely humanitarian concern, though that played a role. It was strategic calculation of the highest order. MacArthur understood that the occupation of Japan would succeed or fail based on whether the Japanese people accepted American authority as legitimate. If U.S. forces behaved like conquerors, seizing property, committing violence, exploiting the population, they would breed resistance, sabotage, and lasting hatred. But if American troops demonstrated that occupation did not mean subjugation, that military victory did not require civilian destruction, then Japan might be transformed from enemy to ally. The contrast with Japanese military behavior in occupied territories could not have been more stark. Where Japanese forces had ruled through terror and extraction, American forces attempted to rule through law and commerce. Where Japanese soldiers had taken without compensation, American soldiers offered payment. Where Japanese occupation had been predicated on the assumption that conquered peoples existed only to serve the conqueror, American occupation was predicated on the idea that even defeated peoples retained certain rights and dignities. This was not universal, and it was not perfect. There were American soldiers who broke the rules, who engaged in black market activity, who committed crimes. There were instances of violence, theft, and exploitation. Military police arrested more than 1.22 million individual Japanese citizens for black market activities in 1946 alone, suggesting that illicit trade flourished despite official policy. Some American troops sold their cigarette rations on the black market for enormous profits. Some took Japanese women as mistresses, relationships that existed in morally complex spaces between genuine affection and economic desperation. But the overwhelming pattern, the general practice that defined the occupation at ground level, was American troops following orders to treat Japanese civilians with basic respect. And for Japanese people who had been taught that Americans were demons, this was cognitively dissonant to the point of trauma. What did the food that American soldiers carried with them represent to hungry Japanese civilians? It was more than mere calories, though those mattered desperately. It was a glimpse into an entirely different world, a world whose existence they had been taught to deny. Consider the contents of a standard American K-ration in 1945. Each box contained not just food but an overwhelming abundance of it. Canned meat, crackers, candy, chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum, powdered coffee, sugar tablets, fruit bars. A single K-ration provided approximately 3,000 calories, nearly 3 times what an average Japanese civilian consumed in an entire day. American soldiers complained about K-rations, considering them barely palatable emergency food. Japanese civilians saw them as miraculous treasures. The contrast extended to every aspect of American material culture that Japanese people encountered. American trucks were enormous, powerful machines that dwarfed Japanese vehicles. American uniforms were sturdy, well-made, replaced when they wore out. American soldiers had boots that fit properly, socks without holes, helmets that actually protected them. They had cigarettes by the carton, not individually rationed. They had chocolate, which many Japanese children had never tasted. They had chewing gum, a bizarre substance that served no nutritional purpose, but existed purely for pleasure. They had coffee, sugar, meat, butter, bread made from wheat so white it looked artificial. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an economic system that Japanese civilians had been taught was decadent, weak, and doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. Japanese wartime propaganda had endlessly mocked American materialism, claiming that Americans were soft, unwilling to sacrifice, incapable of the spiritual strength that supposedly defined Japanese culture. The propaganda had insisted that American abundance was a sign of moral weakness, that hardship built character, that Japan's poverty was actually a virtue. But now Japanese civilians could see with their own eyes that American abundance had produced the weapons, the planes, the ships, the entire industrial machine that had crushed Japan's military. They could see that American soldiers, far from being weakened by their comfortable lives, were healthy, well-fed, and disturbingly competent. They could see that the ideology of sacred poverty that had been used to justify their suffering was, perhaps, a lie. The simple act of an American soldier paying for eggs became a crack in the entire edifice of wartime propaganda. If Americans were demons, why did they pay? If Americans were bent on destroying Japan, why did they bring food aid to prevent starvation? If American democracy was weak and decadent, why had it defeated the Japanese Empire so completely? These questions had no good answers within the framework that Japanese civilians had been given to understand the world. And so, slowly, painfully, millions of Japanese people began constructing new frameworks. They began questioning what they had been told. They began wondering if the system that had led them into catastrophic defeat might have been built on foundations of lies. The transformation of Japanese perceptions did not happen overnight, and it was not universal. Many Japanese citizens, particularly in rural areas, remained suspicious of Americans for months or years. The older generation, raised under the Meiji Emperor and steeped in traditional values, struggled to accept that Japan had been wrong. Nationalist elements viewed cooperation with occupiers as betrayal. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, Japanese police expected widespread violence, rape, and disorder when American troops arrived. They had prepared themselves for the worst. What they got instead were young American men, many of them barely out of high school, who mostly followed orders to treat Japanese people with basic decency. The occupying forces established strict rules about fraternization with Japanese civilians, though these rules were loosened over time as it became clear that positive interactions helped rather than hindered the occupation's goals. American military police patrolled areas where U.S. troops were stationed, arresting soldiers who committed crimes and subjecting them to courts-martial. There was a genuine effort, imperfect but real, to maintain discipline. Japanese civilians began testing the boundaries. Farmers who had expected their produce to be seized discovered they could negotiate prices. Shop owners who had hidden their goods found that American soldiers actually wanted to pay. Children who had been taught to fear Americans discovered that soldiers handed out chocolate bars and chewing gum. Women who had been told they would be raped on sight found that most American troops, while certainly interested in female company, operated within the basic bounds of civilized behavior. This is not to sanitize the occupation or pretend it was perfect. There were brothels established specifically to serve American troops, staffed by desperate Japanese women who had few other options in a devastated economy. There was a disturbing prevalence of sexual assault, particularly in the early months of occupation, though the rates were lower than Japanese officials had feared. There was exploitation, corruption, and abuse. The black market that flourished during the occupation period enriched some and impoverished others. American cigarettes became currency, creating economic distortions that would take years to unwind. But the fundamental pattern held. American occupation was different from Japanese occupation. It operated on different principles. It was still occupation, still foreign control, still an imposition on Japanese sovereignty. But it was not annihilation. It was not systematic brutality. It was not the complete destruction of Japanese society that propaganda had promised. And Japanese farmers, in their fields and rice paddies and vegetable gardens across the country, held U.S. military scrip in their hands and tried to comprehend what it meant. Consider the meaning of money itself in this context. Money represents something more fundamental than mere economic exchange. It represents a mutual acknowledgement of humanity, a recognition that the other party in the transaction is a person with rights, with property, with standing in the community. When you pay someone for their goods, you are implicitly recognizing that those goods belong to them, that they have the right to decide whether to sell, that the transaction is voluntary on both sides. Conquest, by contrast, negates all of this. When soldiers simply take what they want, they are declaring that the conquered have no rights, no property, no standing. They are declaring that might makes right, that the strong owe nothing to the weak, that possession is the only law that matters. This was the philosophy that had governed Japanese military behavior in occupied territories. It was the philosophy that had governed warfare for thousands of years across most of human history. What American troops were doing in Japan represented something different. something that cut against the grain of most historical precedent. They were asserting that even defeated peoples retained certain basic rights, that even in occupation, property rights mattered, that even between victor and vanquished, commercial exchange should be voluntary and compensated. This was revolutionary. And it was not merely theoretical. Every time an American soldier paid a Japanese farmer for food, he was enacting a small drama of legitimacy. He was demonstrating that American power was constrained by law, even when that law could have been ignored with no practical consequences. What could a starving Japanese farmer do if American soldiers simply took his rice? Nothing. The power differential was absolute. The old farmer had no means of resistance, no recourse, no protection. And yet American troops paid anyway. Not because they had to, not because they feared consequences, but because they had been ordered to do so, and those orders reflected a set of values that American military commanders wanted to project onto occupied Japan. Those values were democratic capitalism, the belief that free exchange of goods and services created mutual prosperity, the belief that property rights were fundamental to a functioning society, the belief that even defeated enemies could be transformed into allies through consistent, fair treatment, the belief that might did not make right, that power should be exercised within frameworks of law and custom and basic morality. Japanese farmers, standing in their fields holding American money, were receiving their first practical lesson in democracy, not through lectures or constitutional reforms or abstract political theory, but through the simple, concrete experience of being paid for their goods, of being treated as people with rights rather than subjects to be exploited, of participating in voluntary exchange rather than being subjected to forcible extraction. This was how hearts and minds were actually won, not through propaganda broadcasts or leaflets dropped from planes, but through thousands of individual interactions where American soldiers demonstrated, through their behavior, that American occupation would be different, that Japan's defeat did not mean Japan's destruction, that there was another way to organize society, another relationship between power and people. The symbolic weight of payment extended beyond the immediate transaction. It represented American abundance at a material level and American values at a philosophical level. Consider what Japanese civilians observed when they encountered American supply systems. The logistics of the American military were staggering in scale. Food, equipment, fuel, clothing, medicine, everything flowed from the United States to Japan in quantities that seemed impossible. Ships arrived daily at Japanese ports, carrying supplies for occupation forces. Warehouses bulged with goods. American military bases, even small ones in rural areas, had access to resources that dwarfed what the Japanese military had been able to provide its own troops during the war. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of the most powerful economy in human history, operating at peak industrial capacity. The United States in 1945 produced nearly 50% of all manufacturing output globally. American factories had churned out planes, ships, tanks and weapons on a scale that the Japanese military had simply not anticipated. The same industrial capacity that had won the war now sustained the occupation. Japanese civilians, taught that American capitalism was inefficient and doomed, saw with their own eyes that American capitalism had buried the Japanese empire under an avalanche of material goods. The ideology of spiritual strength over material resources, which had been central to Japanese wartime propaganda, now appeared tragically delusional. You could not win a modern war with fighting spirit alone. You needed steel, oil, rubber, aluminum, explosives, food, medicine, and the industrial capacity to produce all of it in staggering quantities. Japan had lacked that capacity. America had possessed it in overwhelming abundance. When an American soldier paid a Japanese farmer with military scrip backed by the U.S. government, he was handing over a piece of paper that represented the full faith and credit of that industrial colossus. The money was worth something because America was powerful enough to make it worth something. The transaction was possible because America had the resources to sustain hundreds of thousands of troops on foreign soil indefinitely, while simultaneously feeding millions of Japanese civilians to prevent famine. This was the power that had defeated Japan. Not cruelty, not brutality, not the willingness to commit atrocities, but the sheer overwhelming capacity to produce, to organize, to sustain complex operations across vast distances over extended periods. The ability to feed not just your own troops, but your defeated enemies. The ability to operate within frameworks of law and commerce, even when brute force would have been simpler. Japanese farmers, examining the unfamiliar currency in their hands, were holding physical proof of American power, and that power was being exercised, at least at the level they could see, with restraint and even with generosity. The epilogue of this story extends far beyond those initial encounters in farmyards and village squares. The pattern established in the first months of occupation, payment for goods, respect for property rights, voluntary exchange, became the foundation for a broader transformation of Japanese society. MacArthur's occupation authority would spend 7 years remaking Japan politically, economically, and socially. A new constitution would enshrine democratic principles and renounce war. Land reform would break up large estates and create a class of independent farmers. Educational reforms would emphasize individual rights over collective obedience. Women would gain suffrage. Labor unions would be legalized. The Zaibatsu corporate conglomerates would be partially dismantled. But underlying all of these formal reforms was the lived experience of millions of Japanese people who had discovered that American occupation was not the hell they had been promised, that the enemy they had been taught to hate as demons were, in fact, simply young men far from home who followed orders, paid for what they took, and treated Japanese civilians with basic courtesy. This matters because legitimacy is built through experience, not through declarations. The Japanese people accepted American occupation authority and later accepted the reforms that MacArthur imposed, because they had seen at ground level that American power was not purely destructive, that it operated according to rules, that it was willing to invest enormous resources in rebuilding rather than simply extracting, that it treated even defeated enemies as humans with rights rather than as objects to be exploited. The transformation of Japan from militarist empire to democratic ally, which historians often attribute to MacArthur's political genius, or to the shock of defeat, or to the terms of the new constitution, was rooted in something more fundamental. It was rooted in thousands of small moments where American troops demonstrated through their actions what American values meant in practice, where they paid farmers for food, where they established medical clinics for Japanese civilians, where they brought in grain to prevent starvation, where they prosecuted American soldiers who committed crimes, where they showed, consistently if imperfectly, that occupation did not have to mean oppression. The old farmer, Tanaka Yoshio, would live another 15 years, long enough to see Japan transformed beyond recognition. He would see American aid shipments arrive to prevent famine in 1946. He would see his village get electricity for the first time. He would see his granddaughter attend school past elementary age, something his own daughters had never done. He would see democratic elections, though he never quite trusted politicians. He would see prosperity return, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as Japan rebuilt. And he would remember that morning in November 1945, when American soldiers had come to his farm, and he had been certain his life was ending. He would remember standing in his farmyard holding U.S. military scrip, his hands trembling, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He would remember the young American soldier with hair the color of wheat, smiling as he paid for eggs, saying words Tanaka didn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. Thank you. That memory would stay with him until his death. That simple transaction, money for eggs, which had seemed so impossible in the moment, which had contradicted everything he had been taught about war and conquest and the nature of soldiers and the behavior of armies. That moment when the world, as he understood it, had shifted on its axis, and he had been forced to confront the possibility that everything he had believed might be wrong. We tell ourselves stories about war and peace, about conquerors and conquered, about how power operates in the world. We create narratives of good and evil, of barbarians and civilized peoples, of the strong who take and the weak who suffer. These stories shape our understanding of history, and our expectations for the future. The story of Japanese farmers paid by American troops is important precisely because it violates our expectations. It suggests that power can be exercised with restraint, that victors can treat the vanquished with dignity, that occupation, while never desired, can be conducted in ways that minimize harm and even create opportunities for transformation, that the principles of commerce and property rights and voluntary exchange are not mere abstractions but practical tools for building legitimacy and trust. This is not a story that justifies occupation or glorifies American imperialism. The United States occupied Japan because it had defeated Japan militarily, and the occupation served American strategic interests in containing communism and securing influence in East Asia. American policy toward Japan was not purely altruistic. It was calculated to transform a dangerous enemy into a reliable ally, and it succeeded in that goal in ways that continue to shape global politics 80 years later. But the mechanism of that transformation matters. Japan did not become democratic because democracy was imposed by force. Japan became democratic because millions of Japanese people, through lived experience, came to believe that democratic capitalism offered something better than the militarist authoritarianism that had led them to ruin. They came to that belief gradually, through countless small experiences, through seeing American abundance and recognizing it as the fruit of a different economic system, through participating in voluntary exchange and discovering its benefits, through being treated with basic respect and realizing that occupation did not have to mean subjugation. And it began for many with the shock of being paid, with the cognitive dissonance of expecting theft and experiencing purchase, with the simple but profound experience of an American soldier reaching into his pocket, pulling out money, and treating a Japanese farmer as a person with rights rather than as a subject to be exploited. In farmyards and village squares across Japan in the months following surrender, a quiet revolution unfolded, not the revolution of constitutions and political structures, which would come later and receive all the historical attention, but the revolution of changed expectations, of shifted assumptions, of minds open to the possibility that everything they had been taught about their enemy might be wrong. The old farmer stood in his field, holding unfamiliar currency, watching a truck disappear down a dirt road. The mist was burning off as the sun rose higher. His wife and daughter-in-law stood beside him, equally stunned into silence. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked. The rice paddies lay dormant, waiting for spring. Life would continue, though nothing would ever be quite the same. They paid us, his wife said again, still unable to believe it. Tanaka Yoshio nodded slowly, closing his fingers around the money. They paid us such a simple thing, such an ordinary transaction, money for food, the exchange that has formed the basis of civilization for millennia. But in that moment, in that place, after that war, it was everything. It was the beginning of understanding that perhaps the demons were not demons after all, that perhaps the propaganda had been lies, that perhaps there was another way to organize society, another relationship between power and people, another future beyond the ashes of defeat. The revolution would not be televised or announced with trumpets. It would happen in millions of small moments like this one, scattered across a devastated nation, as people discovered through lived experience that what they had been taught to fear might actually be the path to something better. As they discovered that American abundance was real, that American values were more than propaganda, that democracy was not weak but strong, that freedom was not chaos but opportunity. And it began with payment for eggs, with respect for property, with the simple but revolutionary act of treating a conquered farmer as a human being with rights. This was the truth that would reshape Japan and echo through the decades to come, that power constrained by principle is more potent than power unleashed without restraint, that treating even defeated enemies with dignity can transform them into allies, that the strongest foundations for peace are built not through force alone, but through the patient accumulation of countless small gestures that demonstrate, day by day, transaction by transaction, that another world is possible. The old farmer looked down at the money in his hand, then he looked up at the sky, where the sun was burning away the mist, revealing a landscape he had known his entire life but which now somehow seemed different, transformed not by violence but by its unexpected absence, changed not by conquest but by the possibility, still tentative and uncertain, of something that might be called peace. He tucked the money carefully into his jacket and turned back toward his farmhouse, where his family waited. There was work to be done. There was survival to manage. There was a future to build, though its shape remained unclear. But for the first time since the surrender, he felt something other than despair. He felt hope, and that perhaps was the greatest revolution of all.